When I played the original Shin Megami Tensei, I felt it was an extremely special, important title for its powerful themes and setting. However, it was still a punishing, painfully boring and slow game that makes me never want to play it again. This was why I've hesitated at going back and playing the sequel, Shin Megami Tensei 2 from 1994, except that it fixes almost every issue I had with the original, making for a much more playable, engaging and rewarding journey. SMT2, much like the first game, is blissfully easy to play thanks to the Aeon Genesis translation that has enabled easy emulation and even custom physical SNES copies. The emulation seems great, albeit the formatting of the text is a little janky, and there was a point where it would hardlock during fusions early into the game, so having a few save states just in case is a good idea. Frustratingly, there does exist proper remasters for both SMT1 and 2. These look really cool and would be what I'd play, except neither are translated, making them near unplayable for gaijins like myself. Atlus may start putting more of the titles online, but the catalogue is certainly broad, and the OG games are hardly the most demanded ones. Unlike the rest of the mainline titles, SMT2 is a proper continuation of the first game, taking place decades after the original's ending, following the law or neutral routes. From the cataclysmic war of the first game, in Tokyo's place emerged Tokyo Millennium, a self-contained megacity controlled by the Order of Messiah, one of the two major factions from the first game. The plot of SMT2 is much more involved and expansive than the originals, which could be summarized in a couple paragraphs. While I'll certainly spoil the early sections, this isn't an overview of the entire story. However, I understand if you want to play it blind when the narrative is such a massive draw. As the game starts, you're playing as some amnesiac gladiator, trying to eke out a living at some trash dojo. The opening is much faster than the first game. It's only a few minutes till you're fighting your first demons, a regular nuisance at this point, and leveling up your character. Here you train, get a lay of the land, and through meeting up with the impossibly alive Steven, you're given a demon summoning program. It becomes clear through flashbacks and achieving victories in the local coliseum that you're actually, supposedly, maybe, the Messiah that has been awaited for. Canonically named Aleph, you're set up by the Messiah authorities to get rid of irritant demons and lead humanity into the Thousand-Year Kingdom. You're assisted by a bunch of allies who bear a striking similarity to the characters of the original, and even get Kerubus, your old doggo boy, as a teammate to wreck shit up. This is all within the first few hours of play. It moves at an almost breakneck pace as you meet dozens of characters and learn the lore in different districts of Millennium, all while you gain better equipment and skills. It's also when you get to notice the Messiah's more unethical methods and heavy-handed tactics for creating a perfect society, one of intense hierarchies, devotion and control, and whilst publicly they're staunchly anti-demon, privately demonic abilities are just too useful for them to ignore. This leads the player to flirt with the cult of Gaia, whose members offer greater freedom of choice in coexistence with the demons, as long as you ignore the more cutthroat elements of their belief system. Of course, SMT2 doesn't stay well enough in the cyberpunk millennium setting, and soon you'll be venturing underground through lost ruins, exploring demonic homelands and netherworlds, and virtual reality utopias as you begin uncovering various machinations and conspiracies to control the destiny of mankind. The merging of far-flung sci-fi concepts, apocalyptic environments of ruined cities, and high fantasy planes inhabited by countless mythical gods results in a very original and thematically compelling journey. Both the Messiah and Gaian factions represent the law and chaos alignments which you'll inevitably bounce between. To keep it simple, law is one of devotion to God and abiding his rules for the greater good of humanity, whilst chaos looks to maximize personal freedoms and reduce structures of control. This is like the first game, except it's much more interesting this time around since you actually get to experience the societies they've created and their beliefs in practice. The first game only had a handful of significant characters, whilst here there's a multitude that have developed their own communities and relationships, which makes opposing them much harder. You'll witness what drives these people alongside how the faction corrupts them by seeking to destroy the other, all while offering great incentives for you to join up. Despite there being a neutral route that rejects both law and chaos's extremism for a third way, this is not an easy path filled with rewards, merely just another set of ethics. It can feel very dour and morally grey as you witness the brutal consequences of each side. Fortunately, Shin Megami Tensei 2 serves up the offbeat humour and charm that's so emblematic and yet underrated in the franchise. There's plenty of downtime where you can explore bars, talk to patrons about current events, and get smashed with your friends, which somehow boosts your stats. You'll chase after some elf fuck who's casting love potions at your companions, then gain upgrades from Steven in the VR simulations. There's occasional clubs where you can rave alongside demons and humans alike, or while ancient deities are rising from their slumber to continue fighting impossibly ancient battles. However, because of the complexity and abandonment of the more grounded world of the original, there are inevitable pitfalls the plot stumbles at. particularly in its pacing. The game will introduce seemingly major characters and locations, and then proceed to kill them off or entirely ignore them. It can really feel, especially in the strangeness of the late game, that there were competing visions for what the plot was supposed to be, so that by the end it's practically unrecognizable from the initial few hours. The game is also not as nuanced as one would hope. Your character's alignment is shifted to one of the three spectrums via performing lawful, neutral, or chaotic actions, killing enemies of the opposing alignment or donating money to the temples. It's not super clear where you are in terms of alignment, and since doing morally good things shifts you to law, most players will probably end up on the lawful route without realizing it. There should have been more ethical dilemmas you must have confronted when picking a side. Still though, what's offered in SMT2's main quest, for the most part, is almost constant action, clever foreshadowing, world building, new characters and events that feels wholly unique and a great advancement from the originals. When looking at the stories chronologically, what stands out is how they switch between relatively straightforward narratives to epic sagas. SMT 1 and 3 are relatively compact stories with a handful of characters and major plot points. Compare this to SMT 2 and 4, where there are various factions, societies, competing interests, and people. I say this because although there's a lot of overlap between production crews for all the games, SMT 5 looks to follow the more narrow direction of the first and third game. At least in my view. SMT 2's presentation is a step up with greater textures, sprite work, and a more interesting colour palette, but certainly not a standout for SNES RPGs. The more detailed backdrops is always nice, albeit the sprite work doesn't fully represent the quality artwork they're drawn from. The music is of similar quality to the first game, with a bit more variety for the overworlds. Some of it, like the late game boss music, is good, but most will quickly get repetitive and boring with such basic sampling. An objectively huge improvement to SMT's very archaic and basic game design, even for the time, is the quest progression and exploration. SMT2 is very much a linear title compared to other RPGs. There's only a handful of side quests and optional challenges off the beaten path. There's instead a greater variety in locales, story beats, character interactions, and set-piece moments that give more personality to the largely unchanged turn-based dungeon crawler gameplay. The world map you traverse on has been improved with a more isometric perspective. Instead of random destroyed streets, you'll have to navigate the area more thoroughly to find new pathways and places of interest. Locations are connected via terminals which work as save and fast travel points, usually marked on your map with a cross. Interiors are laid out like typical 90s first-person mazes, usually with multiple floors you must scale, bosses to defeat, and puzzles such as invisible walls, dark rooms, teleporters, pits, and collectibles. It's only slightly more complex over contemporary titles, occasionally requiring a couple of notepads to keep track of where you're going, yet there were still decent digressions from the combat. There are frequent towns throughout the game with various shops which sell equipment, goods, and heal your team or offer special services. This includes the newly added appraiser that details your items and their effects, very useful. You can now also sell and buy items in bulk, which makes reorganizing your inventory much easier. A really nice addition are fortune tellers that point where you need to go for the main quest. Not exactly subtle, yet far better than aimlessly wandering through the maps, getting into pointless battles until consulting a guide. The aforementioned bars are also great sources of information, and getting updates on quest lines was also chugging back a few brewskis. Casinos have now been added where you can gamble cash for prizes. This isn't required for the main quest, nor is I in particular need of monies and minigames, though it's a fine enough distraction. Although there's a proper dedicated map button which doesn't constantly reorientate, these locations don't seem to get marked unless I've turned off some feature. To avoid losing track of important places and NPCs, you can mark them on the map, yet this shouldn't be necessary just to know where the terminals or shops are. Besides delving the depths of various mazes, you have the battle system where your party dukes out with a massive variety of enemies. This is fairly similar to the originals and even older JRPG titles. You'll enter random battles where you order your party a list of commands from attacking, using items, defending, healing, and a variety of magic skills like elemental attacks, buffs, and debuffs. Understanding magic is easy by the descriptions available for each one and faster casting time. Because of the frequent encounters, you'll mostly select the auto battle option, which just runs through your prior move list. There's a bit more strategy here, like organising the placement of team members, affecting their accuracy, defense, and when they have their turn, as well as facing multiple opponents at once. The bosses are decently challenging, requiring preparation of your party so as to complement each other's abilities. Although this often devolves into just maximising your attack power. I found SMT2's combat much less tedious, as the gameplay is faster and encounters slightly less common. You can even buy items or use magic that stops random encounters temporarily if you just want to explore uninterrupted. Early Megaten games are considered notoriously difficult, but it was pretty easy here with far fewer insta-kill magic attacks. A lot of the same exploits from the first game carry on here. Guns can be fitted with status-inflicting ammo that can wipe out swarms of enemies, and there's plenty of healing items around. After the first couple of hours, you'll be kitted out with a full team of powerful demons and weapons. There's even a hotkey to heal your party instead of painfully selecting the same item or skill a dozen times. Leveling up doesn't mean much aside from boosting a few stats, being able to wield high-level demons, or one of your party members unlocking a new ability. Aleph can't use magic, so those related stats are nearly worthless. However, one of your permanent teammates does, so you'll always have a healer on hand to remove any ailments. If you get stuck at one of the game's bosses or harder dungeons, you can quickly grind the virtuals that allows you to fight a variety of tough demons without the threat of dying. It's also here you can meet up with Steven and receive new upgrades like holding more demons or identifying items manually, so skipping past them will actually gimp your character late game. Building up your party is done either through demon negotiations or fusion, two classic cornerstones of the franchise's gameplay, and even decades later, it's still very satisfying. You can enter into negotiations whenever in battle and be asked a series of questions relating to your demands, alignments, and beliefs. Getting a demon on your team usually just requires being a high enough level or giving them some gifts, which can be a boring process of saying yes a couple or a few dozen times. There are neat details here. Particular demons are simply incapable of communication or will take offense at ignoring them, and even run away if you have the same demon in your party who's dead, essentially dragging their friend's corpse around. It's well worth doing just for the quirky dialogue and characters alone, spanning the gambit of humorous and completely bizarre, with talking cars, Beetlejuice, cyborgs, and Lovecraftian horrors all making an appearance. Of course, old favourites are here, like the Jack Bros, along with a sweeping of religious and mythical figures with dialogue that rarely feels copy-pasted. It's serious polish, leaving me wondering what the devs were inspired by. Wait, what the fuck? The other way of acquiring demons is through the classic fusion system, whereby you go to a cathedral of shadows and mash multiple demons together into a more powerful one. There is such a wide selection of fusible demons that you'll be constantly experimenting with different combinations based on levels, alignments, and class. It's worth noting you can bypass the level cap by fusing demons with human allies, which if properly exploited can totally break the difficulty with very high demons early on. From the late 80s to the 2020s, Demon Fusion remains a highlight of the franchise in building and specializing your party, helping to keep the random battles somewhat palatable. There are a couple other additions to the cathedrals, being now you can fuse swords together or with demons, but in my playthrough, like the casinos, I never saw a need to use it. A crucial overlooked mechanic of demon summoning is that it consumes your magnetite, basically soul energy shit. This makes sense in balancing out your party and preventing you from having too many powerful demons at once. Unfortunately, the devs seem to have forgotten to drop magnetite after most battles, and there's even entire multi-hour sections of the game where there's zero magnetite available. So your choice is to either constantly heal your party, taking attritional damage, or simply rely on only having one or two human teammates stun-locking crowds of enemies with guns. Despite the NPCs to help guide you and improve UI, greatly reducing bullshit, nonsense, misdirection garbage, Atlas still includes some for reasons I'd only imagine to pad the game and waste my fucking time. The worst offender is when gathering up a bunch of pillars for the main quest, most you'll come across via just playing, but a couple are very obscure. One involves winning a dance contest, which should be simple enough fun, if not that you must have your magic stat, a useless one, at 10. So either you grind hundreds of demons or get very particular equipment and drink at the bar to boost your stats. You'll also have to trudge back to previous areas to talk to an NPC who now has some item available. If I haven't been clear, thank fuck for those map markers. This all leads to large chunks of content feeling very disconnected from the main quest. You'll start to parcel out major revelations regarding Millennium, the factions, and your character, leading to a bunch of characters getting killed or switching alliances. And then you spend hours in an arduous, multi-hour series of dungeons for just one quest item. It was impressive how fast Atlas killed my engagement and enthusiasm for the game before rekindling it, but I still prefer not grinding in a dozen fucking mazes. On this topic, people regularly commented on my first SMT video that through the emulator's speed up function, you can bypass the grind. Except you really don't need to once you get the skills that reduce enemy encounters, making the second half of the game quite breezy. This is why I have such glowing feelings towards Shin Megami Tensei 2 over its predecessor. It smoothens much of the roughness and ungainly design features for a more fluid and exciting adventure that feels as unique yet in line with the themes of the franchise. The storytelling is consistently insane, all while engrossing and well presented. The UI and combat is taken further in depth and detail, resulting in less tedium and annoying bullshit. The character and charm shines even after decades on such practically ancient hardware that made the smaller blemishes manageable. By no means a perfect game, or even one widely accessible to less diehard fans who can't stand the outdated combat systems, SMT2 was a worthwhile experience, at least for me, someone who's thoroughly enjoyed the franchise for the last decade. I feel afterwards, my appreciation for what Atlus has gradually achieved over the decades and the tonal and thematic brilliance of subsequent games has only grown. If you want to go back, before Persona, before Atlus and their brand was a figurative household name to something more humble, yet equally impressive and memorable, Shin Megami Tensei 2 will be that game.